I'll wait until 2. Let's go. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from FDA on thinking collectively whilst working remotely. I'm Sue from FDA, and I'll be handing over shortly to Katie, who will be the presenter for today's webinar. Before I do that, there's a few housekeeping items for you to note. For those of you who are unfamiliar with webinars, there's a chat panel to the side where you can leave comments, and I can see some of you have already been introducing yourselves, which is really great to see. And below here, there's an ask a question function. So if you'd like to put your questions in there, Katie will respond to those during or after the session, depending on how we go through this. Don't worry if you miss anything today. We'll be sending you all a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides and any other resources that Katie might reference. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Katie.
Great, many thanks, Sue, and hello to everyone. And looks like everyone's at least looking out on some nice bright sunshine, if not actually sitting out in it. But I guess that's one of the pleasures sometimes of working from home, is that if you have a garden or a balcony or a patio or something, occasionally you can sneak out and work there. So thank you very much, as always, to the FDA for hosting this webinar, and thank you everyone for being online and taking the time to join us today. So for myself, I'm Katie Driver. I was formerly a civil servant, working for many years in what's now the Department for Work and Pensions and in the Department for Education. And it's a pleasure to continue my connections with the world of the civil service and all the work that you do, because it felt very real and important to me back then and still does now. But what I do for the most of my time now is work with people either individually or in groups to develop their capacity to think well for themselves, to think well with each other, and to become more purposeful and intentional in what they do. So hopefully our time today will help give you some fresh thoughts about how you can think collectively, how you can think well with other people, particularly at a time when we can't huddle in a room around a flip chart or a whiteboard, which might be what we wanted to do, in previous times. So, how do we get that same sense of shared problem solving, of shared idea generation, when we can't actually be in the same room as each other? So in terms of the content for today, if we can have the next slide, Sue, please. There are 3 chunks that I'm going to go through. First of all, I want to say a piece about the foundations of helping people to think well for themselves. It's something that is so fundamental to everything that we do that I think it's worth showcasing and talking about today. And then we'll talk about how do we think around the challenge, the problem, the thing that's been set. How can we open up our thinking in ways that's helpful? And then the final section will be looking at how do we think together about solutions and coming up with possible ways forward. And I'll drop in various suggestions for techniques and things and tips so that you can use virtually. And there'll be plenty of things that you can share, I'm sure, in the chat box, and we'll have various points when we pause for thought and to share ideas. And actually, we're going to do that first of all, our first point. So if we can have the next slide, I'd love to know what it is that you are grappling with, that you're thinking, I could really do with one of those heads together moments. What are the sorts of things that you're trying to problem solve or come up with solutions for? So if you could pop in the chat box any things that you're grappling with, any challenges that you are trying to work through, it would be lovely to see what sort of territory people are in at the moment. And I'm wondering, I can see at least one person's actually saying she's having difficulty with the sound, but I hope that's Yeah, okay, that may just be a localized thing. Okay, so good to see some things in there. Yeah, agreeing on priorities. Yeah, that's really difficult because everybody's got a different view as to what the priorities are. So how are we going to get that joint agreement? And that's related to how to keep the team focused. How do we make sure that we're all collectively working on the things that matter? And how do we think about how to transition to the new business as usual? Yep, that's a lovely whole area in itself as to how to make sure that what we're doing now, if it is going to be some kind of longish term way of working, how we're going to transition from the stuff that we kind of cobble together in an instant to making it more long term, and how to adapt plans for the new world, in a similar vein. So how do we meet those kinds of challenges when we can't come together? Well, the good news, of course, is that we can come together. We're simply doing it in a virtual way. So, and yes, good point, Stephen, that it's important to avoid the virtual meeting fatigue because, it's so easy to end up on back-to-back MS Teams, Zooms, CloudShare, whatever platform or platforms you're linked into, and that's incredibly tiring. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about will make sure that you can mix things up. I very intentionally included some opportunities for people to think offline as well as online, because that mix is absolutely vital. We just get totally phased by too much screen time, quite apart from all ending up with square eyes. I think the opticians are going to do very nicely when everything starts to open up again. Okay, so great to have that sense of what you're trying to grapple with. And so let's take a look at the first chunk, which is about setting those foundations for helping people to think well. And I make no apology for including this because we are all employed to think well. It's our brains that the civil service needs from us, and actually it's what we often want to do. It's why we join the civil service. It's why we're interested in the public policy and operations and statistical or research or whatever challenges that face us, is because they interest us and they engage us. So let's think about how we can set the stage so we can do the good thinking that we want to do. So I want to mention a couple of particular ways of working that are really, I find, helpful in getting people to think well together. So this first one that I'm mentioning is the thinking environment. And this is a particular approach, and we'll share some resources on this at the end when you get the link. But it's a particular way of working that comes from an approach developed by a woman called Nancy Klein, and internationally there's a whole group of us now that work in this way. And the premise of this way of working is that the quality of everything that we do is dependent on the quality of the thinking that we do first. So if we never get the chance to do some good thinking, we're unlikely to have the chance to do really good action and to make things really meaningful. And if you start from that premise that good quality thinking is really important, then obviously the next thing to think about is, how do we think well? What are some of the prerequisites? So what we talk about in the thinking environment is a range of components which come together as a framework. And really, you don't need to know all of the details. But there are a few that I've highlighted here which are easy to use and incredibly powerful if used well. So the first one is attention. And it is quite amazing how much better another person's thinking can become if you simply give them really good attention. If you promise not to interrupt them as they think a thought through all of the different waves and different pauses that might include, it's amazing how effective attention can be. And obviously we can give that to each other online as well, by respecting our colleagues when we're on a call or a Zoom or whatever with them, by not having other screens open, by trying not to allow the other stuff that might be going on in our households or in our thinking to impinge. We give that really wonderful attention. Equality is there. It's talking not only in the way that we commonly understand equality, but also recognizing that we have equal capacity to think well about things. So it doesn't matter if you're the newest person in the team, if you're from a different background or experience, you all have a capacity to think well. And obviously the link to that is the diversity and the difference that emerges, which is incredibly valuable. That's why we think together, is because we want to hear what other people have got to say and get the different reflections. And the other three E's, place, feelings, are very much about how comfortable can we feel? Can we feel that a place that we're going to think, whether it's virtual or real life, is somewhere where we feel we matter and we count? And the importance of feelings as a way of tapping into what we think and allowing feelings to occur, because if they don't, they get in the way of good thinking. So there's a whole number of things that you can be thinking about, and that I think absolutely foundational is the attention, recognizing that everyone can think well, and recognizing that we can all think differently, and that's valuable. So those are good things to be considering when you're trying to think together on an issue. The next chunk is about psychological safety, which is a term you may have come across. It's been championed and pioneered by a professor called Amy Edmondson, based out of Harvard, I believe. And she's been looking at how teams work together, how teams can be really effective. A lot of her thinking started off in the health environment, looking at particular errors, when errors occurred during operations or other procedures. And one of the things she noticed, and this will probably seem very familiar to you, even if you don't come from a health background, is that in some situations, the person who had the vital piece of knowledge did not feel able to share it. Whether that was the anaesthetist who noticed that the dosage was wrong, or the nurse who noticed that the surgeon was holding the wrong piece of equipment, or whatever it was. So this got her thinking about, how do we make it safe for people to take risks, to speak up, even though they might be very junior, even though they might be going to suggest something that goes against the grain. And actually, it's vitally important for, in the medical setting, for the life of the patient, in an aircraft setting, for flying the plane safely, but in all your work as well. You're dealing with really vital matters, and it's really important that you and your team feel able to speak up when they need to. So it's about safe risk taking, and it happens when we feel that we can trust each other, and you almost get to the point where you feel, I can't not say anything, because what the team is working on is so important. It's more important than my personal position or how uncomfortable I might feel in speaking up. So again, psychological safety, I'll put some links to that in the materials. Well, Sue will when she follows up. They're both really worth doing a little bit of digging into, so that you can try and create the conditions where people can say what needs to be said, volunteer their ideas, do their good learning, because these are really important fundamentals. And I'd love to get a sense of what it is that you're doing to make it okay for people to think well and to think differently in your teams or your networks. So if you can again get busy in the chat box, what sorts of things have you been doing that help to build that sense of trust and the safety and being candid? I appreciate in the civil service setting we can't be candid about absolutely everything, but within your team you can often do a lot of sharing. So what sorts of things have you been doing to build that kind of safety and trust? I'd love to see what people have been up to. I know it takes a few minutes to collect one's thoughts and to get finger to keyboard. And I know some of the things that people have suggested previously have included, team chats, and some of the kind of social things that we might do, and that helps to build the bond with the team. So great, thank you, Alison. Holding weekly learning set discussions. Yeah, so recognizing that we're all learning and actually spending time to reflect and review and notice what we've learned is really vital. And some of that learning will be about things that have gone right, and some of that learning will be about things that, if we did it again, perhaps we could try doing it this way or a different way. So really useful thing to do, because it makes it okay for people to say, I'm not sure I did this the best way or the way that I felt most useful, so let's unpack it and take a look. Yep, so encouraging people to do pulse surveys, so giving them places where they can say what needs to be said and share their views and their feelings, regular catch-ups, building rapport, or that sort of thing. And taking the time at the start or the end of the call, just as you would if you were in a real life meeting. You might kind of hang out before the meeting, gathering the chairs together, or there might be a few moments at the end when you're getting your papers and moving to the next meeting. And those little conversations are often where really valuable relationships are cemented and comments are shared that are useful. So all of these are good, and I'm really liking in particular the lessons learned, learning set type things, because that's exactly the territory we're in. We're in the territory of saying, bring something that you did this week, for good or ill, and let's unpack it and have a look at what we can learn from it so that we can move forward. So super, really good to see that people have been doing some of the things in this territory, because it will absolutely help you in what we go into next. So I said I wanted to talk about two chunks of thinking collectively. The first one about kind of defining problems, and the second one is very much about solutions. And before we dive into that, I'd like to share some thoughts about two different types of thinking that we often need to engage in while we work something through. And I share this because certainly I found it useful to just check in with what kind of thinking do I need right now from my people, and therefore what do I need to do to make sure that that happens or to support it happening. So what you've got there is my diagram drawn on the whiteboard, and really what you're looking at is some waves of divergent thinking, when you've been given an initial problem but you want to think out and round and beyond the sort of initial thought, and then start to crystallize that thinking and to converge again into your refined understanding of what the problem is, and then come out again to another phase of divergent thinking. So what are all the possible ways we could tackle this? What are all the things that we might do? And again, to bring in some convergence then towards, okay, so these are the things that we think we probably will do, and to focus our thinking towards a decision. So having that sense of moving from opening out to homing in, opening out, homing in, these are really useful ways of checking out what actually you need from your team. So let's take the first chunk. Let's think about the collective thinking about your challenge. And I think it's really important, and I'm sure people have said this as well, that when you take a problem at face value, you so often end up treating the symptoms rather than the cause, or you perhaps risk making things worse because you've just taken the thing that's presented. And so, it's really worth spending the time working out what actually is it that we're trying to sort out here. Thank you, Daniel, for sharing this sort of double diamond is useful. So I'm glad it's tried and tested in your team. So if we go on to the next slide on this thinking collectively, so we're really in this explore stage, trying to take the thinking out. A really good thing to do, obviously, is to have a first conversation, to have a sense of, what are we dealing with? So let's say, for the sake of argument, you've been asked to consider the issue of homelessness. Perhaps there's a concern that homelessness might start to creep up again as we ease lockdown, and as people who've been in very temporary accommodation might start to kind of feel the need or the desire, or might, the hotels where they're in might be moving back to normal customs. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that's your sort of broad territory. So you might have an initial conversation just to warm people's thinking up. But then there's an awful lot that you could ask people to look into independently. So you could set people off on a challenge. You could talk to the team and say, okay, so who would really like to go and do some digging into the numbers to find out the research and the evidence base. Who has any kind of lived experience or networks with people who have experienced homelessness? Who has some good thinking that they might be able to share on a problem that's little bit like this, but isn't exactly the same. And even having that conversation with your teams, who would like to do these different things? It can play to different people's strengths and their interests and their likelihood to take things forward. So if we can pop the next 3 bullets up, please, Sue. I think the great thing you can do here is with that independent research, you don't have to be online at the same time. You could look as widely as possible. And one of the good things that's happened with us all working virtually is that people are, in a funny kind of way, a lot more accessible. There are all sorts of folks I've bumped into on social media or attended webinars with that I would never have been able to do so in real life. Reaching out and using a shared area, some kind of rolling document or whatever it is that your team finds useful to start to collect the findings. So that explore phase can be done very much independently, so long as people have got a starting point. And one thing I should also say is that you don't have to worry necessarily about having weeks and months to do this. Obviously, it's lovely if you have the luxury of that, but I know in the reality that's very rarely the case. You can go through this approach really quickly. You can do it in a morning, in a couple of hours if you really need to. You can have a conversation at 9 o'clock in the morning. Right, we've got to do something about tackling homelessness. In the next half an hour, who could go and find out what? Have some really focused, but divergent activity going on, and then you can start to come together to share thinking and move through the approach. So, the explore phase: get people off and running, finding out different things. The next thing you're going to want to do is to start to move into a more convergent phase. So if we can have the next slide, that's going to be where you start to focus that thinking onto a fresh understanding of what your problem is. And you probably want to get people to come together. And there are some really good questions that it's helpful to ask. And again, I think, Sue, it's probably helpful to pop these all up. Yep, that's perfect. So having got people out there, antennae pricked, what are the insights that people now have about the challenge? They might see it in quite a different way, and it'd be lovely to have that. What do you now think success would be like? What would the world be like if the problem was solved? What have you got as in terms of the sense of the scope or the parameters, or what's the expectation of quality or time or a particular partners to be involved? Any of those sorts of things, those will probably have started to emerge from that phase too. And that sense of the evidence that would really help move the thinking or the argumentation along. Because some departments are very lucky in having some very rich evidence bases, and you can kind of mine really quite deep down into those evidence bases. But going deep doesn't always help. Sometimes you need to go wide, or sometimes you need to take a cross slice, or sometimes you need to look at it in a different way. So it's using your time, your expertise, and the expertise of the professionals and experts in a really focused way. So this is the sort of bringing together of your challenge, really homing in on what it is that you're trying to resolve, crystallizing the project. And the way to do that in a really neat way, if we have the next slide, is to come up with something called a challenge statement, which is like your pivot point between coming together and then going off again, thinking about solutions. So a really nice challenge statement summarizes what it is you now believe you're going to do. Ideally, it's in really plain English, words that anybody would use, and ideally expressed positively, because when we hear something positive, our brain works in a different way. We tend to feel more expansive and open and interested, rather than negative, which fires all the kind of defensive mechanisms. It explains what things might look like if the problem was solved, but at the same time, it doesn't have any sense of what the solution is, because you don't want to constrain that next phase of thinking. And if you do want to convert it into the next phase, it's good to have a how can we or how might we. So let's say we were working on this homelessness issue. A possible challenge statement might be around, we intend to increase the number of homeless or formerly homeless people living in stable long-term accommodation. Now, in government terms, you might put a number on the increase, you might have a percentage, you might put a time scale on it, all those sorts of things. In an ideal world, you keep it open, because as soon as you put numbers and constraints on it, you constrain the thinking, you constrain what happens. But that's the sort of thing you're looking for, something that says in a really clear and simple way what you're trying to do, because then everybody can get it and do that next phase of thinking, or it helps to inform the rest of the system and all the little mini decisions that people are taking day in, day out. So that challenge statement, it's clear, it's simple, it's positive, it frames the issue without constraining it in terms of any way of solutions. I've said a lot, so I'd love to pause there and check in. First of all, if there are any questions, if there's anything that I've said so far that anyone would like more on, and also to hear from you whether there are things that you've been doing to do that kind of first phase of thinking, to open up a problem, to figure out what might be going on and then refine it so that you're ready for the next stage of work. So, as I say, I'm just going to pause. I can't see anything in the questions and answers box at the moment. So what questions have you got? It's absolutely fine to have questions. Have I whizzed through something too quickly? Have I lost you, or is it all crystal? And equally, always good to know what people have been doing in this kind of territory. Okay, super. Thank you, Julia. So she's used whiteboard in Microsoft Teams to brainstorm ideas. Yeah, and we'll come on to brainstorming and that sort of approach in a moment. But yes, you have got that whiteboard function, which is a really good way of capturing things as they emerge and keeping it quite informal. But nonetheless, you then have something that you can copy and paste and work off afterwards. So that's really good. Yeah, so being able to set people off on a particular focus trail and bring them back can be a really good way of getting to grips with the problem. Another thing you might want to look out for is Fishbone Analysis. That's another thing you can Google, and it's very simple to do a fishbone on a whiteboard, a virtual whiteboard, and get people thinking about possible contributory causes, possible sub-causes, all of those sorts of ways of opening up the problem. Okay, so I'm going to make the assumption that as the chat box hasn't kind of sparked loads, that you're all okay and with me. Thank you, Anna. So let's think about what we would do into that next stage of creating the possible solutions together. And this again is another one of those moments where we tend to huddle around the whiteboard or the flip chart. And that way of working, that brainstorming, feels really good. It's not always the best way of going about things. So if we can go on to the next slide, what we're doing is we want to open up the thinking again. So it's another phase of divergent. We want to generate lots of ideas. And we want to often start off with like the challenge statement. So, how might we increase the number of homeless people living in stable long-term accommodation, or whatever your challenge is? And so just simply put the question. And you need that mindset of welcoming all the ideas. It's so easy to self-censor, not even to speak the idea that's in our own mind. And it's also very easy to comment on other people's ideas unwittingly, for the positive or the negative. So, for example, if someone comes up with an idea, they say, "Oh no, why don't we have a whole load of reconditioned buses and camper vans, and it'll all be wonderful." And you might say, "Oh, that's fantastic." As soon as you've done that, you've sent a signal that that kind of idea is probably good, And therefore there is a category of other ideas that might not be as good. And so everybody else with an idea is then sitting thinking, is my idea kind of a bit like the bus camper van reconditioning thing and is going to get some praise? Or is it a bit different from that? And then I'm not sure. So then I'm not sure I'm going to say anything. So it's really tricky stuff, this. Ideally, you want to be in a phase where people can say whatever they need to say without comment. The other thing is that sometimes people come up with seems like a really outlandish idea. It probably is, to be honest, an outlandish idea, but by some weird trick of how our brains work, it triggers a really fantastic idea in someone else. It might simply be a word or a phrasing they've used. It might not be in any way, shape or form related to the idea. But if that first outlandish thing wasn't said, that next idea that sparked off it might never have happened. So all sorts of reasons for getting everything out there. And you've got, as we've mentioned, online whiteboards, the chat box, the virtual sticky notes, packages, all sorts of things that can be really good ways of capturing ideas. I want to mention in particular, thank you, Julia, for mentioning that. Yeah, the positive and negative thoughts. One thing I wanted to mention is brain writing, which is a way of working where instead of having people talking and one person kind of capturing the ideas on the virtual whiteboard or people writing on them, is to keep it very silent. So you might spend 5 minutes saying, okay, everyone is simply going to be writing ideas, and you can write them in an open space. So whether that's on a whiteboard or some kind of collaborative document area. What then happens is that our brains can choose whether we want to follow our own flow of thoughts and ideas, and that's fine. And some people will have a very rich flow, and others, for whatever reason, haven't got an awful lot initially. But you start to see what others have said, and then you start to think, about connections and new sparks and new ideas, or you can add things onto what they've said. And it can be a really nice way of generating ideas, because it doesn't rely on someone having to speak up. It doesn't rely on knowing whether it's okay to interrupt or not, or when is it your turn, or any of those sorts of things. It's a quieter but often more productive way of getting ideas from a group. So again, that's something that you can Google. There are all sorts of tips and ideas about how to do it. And the final one that's on there is making sure, again, for this lack of screen time, take a moment to go outside. If you can break up this session, it's so much better. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've certainly never had the best ideas when I've been sitting looking at a screen. It's always when I step away, I go and make a cup of tea, I go and take a walk around the block, and it's those moments when you suddenly think, oh, yes, this is what I want to do, or this is the thought that adds something really valuable. So making sure that these phases of working have breaks, have gaps where people are not just going on to another call is really valuable in generating lots of different kinds of ideas and possible ways forward. So hopefully you can get people off and running on lots of divergent thinking, all sorts of different ideas. Then, of course, we can't be in that phase forever. We do need to come think, our ministers, our directors, whoever it is that we're working for wants us to come to a point. So this is where we need to refine the thinking. So some of the things that you can do here that make the most of our virtual space is to get people sharing their ideas in some kind of virtual gallery. And this doesn't have to be constrained. You can say to people, please bring your 3 most interesting ideas. The words there are quite particular. It's not your best ideas, but your most interesting ideas. So generally speaking, if you offer people the chance to bring 3 most interesting ideas, they'll bring something that they think is interesting because they think it's really workable. They'll bring something that's interesting just because it captures something that's really important for them. And they'll probably bring something that's a bit out there, but nonetheless interesting. And so you get a different spread of things. And you can say, present back any way you like. So some people might talk about them, some people might make a PowerPoint slide, some people might even have drawn something and kind of, they can hold it up to camera or share it in advance. There are all sorts of different ways of sharing those ideas, which don't have to require sitting in a deathless Zoom meeting trying to be creative. A couple of things that it's really worth doing in this space as you're looking at the ideas is thinking about what sorts of assumptions are we starting to come up with as we look at these ideas. What are we assuming about feasibility, about scale or scope, or about readiness of partners, or any of those sorts of things? And in a very similar way, there's also going to start building your ability to come up with decision-making criteria. So you might be collectively thinking, oh, we don't quite like that idea, it looks like it's going to take too long. Okay, so does that mean that we've got a particular criterion about time frame? What is the time frame that we're going to look at? What are we assuming about the partners who are going to be involved, whether they're internal, external, how ready are they? Do they need to be part of the decision-making process or not? So if you can speak aloud some of the reasons why you are liking or rejecting particular ideas or aspects of them, that helps to furnish your store of assumptions which turn into risks and the criteria for taking decisions. And that's a really good way of refining 3 or 4 or 5 front runners for you then to do the sort of detailed work of cost benefit analysis, impact assessment, and all the things you need to do. So I hope that helps to show how you can come back together and really refine your thinking. One tool I always mention, and it's just such a fantastic tool for allowing the negative thinking to come out, for getting rid of groupthink and optimism bias. We all think our projects are going to work really well. When I do group work and people have come up with options and then they compare their options with other people's, it's amazing how often, even though in theory they're looking at independent criteria, their own option gets favoured. There are all sorts of things that go on in our brains that are kind of how our brains function that we need to aim off for. So pre-mortems, and again, there'll be some links to this. It came up from a chap called Gary Klein. And the trick with the pre-mortem is to imagine that your favoured option has played out and there's been a complete and utter disaster. It's all gone horribly, horribly wrong. It's kind of almost getting to pandemic scale destruction. Obviously, that's kind of sensitive right now, but you want to be thinking about what's the worst possible scenario, and then get each person to list the reasons why that may have happened. So it may be that a capital project wasn't ready, or that 2 different stakeholders were absolute loggerheads with each other, or that there was a miscommunication, or the IT fell over, or whatever. There'll be all sorts of things that people can very readily think about which may have contributed to that disaster. And then you could go round and invite each person to share 1 or 2 reasons why they thought the project would have been a disaster, and go round until you've got all of those out. And that gives you a fantastic list then to go through and think through, okay, so how likely is this going to be? Is there something we can do now to make sure that it's less likely to happen, or if it happens, it's less impactful? It's a good way of allowing people who actually weren't particularly in favour of a project to say their piece. And in doing so, often they come round to the view that, actually, if we could sort this bit out, I'd feel more inclined towards it. I think it would be more helpful. So pre-mortem's a really good way, and they're kind of fun as well, of getting all of that extra thinking out on the table before you hit the kind of delivery button. So again, I've rattled through a lot, and I'd love to pause and ask you how you've gone about doing that idea generation. How have you got people to think creatively when they've been working remotely? And how have you gone about that process of then whittling things down till you've got a handful of front-running options? So, again, let me know what sorts of things you've been up to in that kind of space. I know one person talked before, Julia, about using MS Whiteboard. Oh yeah, voting polls. Yes, voting polls are really good. So you can, if I was facilitating in a room, I might give everyone 3 sticky dots and say, you can put your sticky dots against 1, 2, or 3 different ideas and see where the interest lies. So that's a nice thing to do. You can do those online. You can just get people with a virtual pen or whatever to mark things. So that's a nice way of getting a sense of where people collectively think that the good ideas are. Thank you, Christina. Zoom calls, scribing and sticking post-its on the wardrobe. Don't necessarily want to repeat it. No, fair enough. I can see why your wardrobe might not be the ideal place. But actually, there is something about seeing words and seeing drawings and seeing representations other than faces. So if you can think of ways of doing that, I've been on a few calls recently where the facilitator has stepped back quite a way and they've had a whiteboard or something kind of just here, and they've kind of turned around and scribbled something and come back, and that can work. You can buy, or your stationery budget can buy stick-on flip charts and things like that. So those are other things that you could be thinking about doing in order to capture the thinking on the flow. So anything else that people have come up with in terms of generating ideas, or is this something that you have been struggling to do? Or if you've got any questions, I'm all ears. And if not, okay. Ideation using mural worked very well in Bayes. Okay, I haven't come across mural, but I'm guessing mural sounds like something that happens on a wall, some kind of virtual wall. I'm guessing that may be a kind of slightly process map sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, if you've got tools, by all means make use of them. And one of the things that you can set people off on at that early problem stage is we tend to look at content and we don't tend to look very much at process. So one of the things you could ask someone to look into, aside from, what else do we know about homelessness or whatever it is what tools could we use as a team when it comes to our collective ideas generation stage? Please could someone go and research that? Or what tools could we use to come to a decision? Please could someone go and research that? So it's just as valid to ask people to look into the process side of things and to review and reflect on what they've used as it is to think about, the content. And the more of you there are, the more of you will be tapping into different meetings of different departments, different stakeholders, and people are using different things. So it's great to be able to see, what others are doing. And thank you, Daniel, for that extra thoughts. It's a virtual whiteboard space where you can be anonymous, which drove greater participation. Yes, that's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, that speaks to that sense of psychological safety of, if you don't have to attach your name to an idea and the possible judgment that comes with it, you can feel freer to suggest what you need to. So yeah, that sounds like a setup that might be worth exploring. So great, thank you for sharing that. So we're coming towards the end of our time. I've suggested there some of the actions that you might want to take. So first of all, to remember what I was saying at the beginning about the foundations for people to think well. I think the absolute number one thing that you can do, and the thing that will make a huge difference if you do nothing else, is to give people your attention. Your absolute undivided attention will be amazing in its effect on other people's thinking. You may not realize how much our thinking is dependent on the other person, but it really, really is. So simply, I say simply, it's not easy, but simply giving people that attention will massively boost the thinking that you get. And then there are the other things to think about as well, in terms of how you're setting it up, how easy is it for people to say what needs to be said. Then think about where your challenge is, what chunk are you in? Is it a convergent phase? Is it a divergent phase? Making sure you have both, because if you have too much divergent, you just end off, going off into the ether and nothing happens. If you have too much convergent, you just go along kind of tram tracks, parallel lines, and you don't get some of the fresh thinking that you might need. So you're going to need both. You're going to need to think about where you are and how you're going to bring them together. And as people have been mentioning with things like learning sets and learning reviews, play with this stuff, have an experiment, see what's happening. Don't forget to look at both the process and the content, what kinds of calls worked, what kinds of calls didn't, what subtleties helped. So asking people, what's your freshest thinking, is a less pressured question than what's your best thinking or your best idea. So there are all sorts of little tweaks that you can make in terms of how you explain things, as well as the processes that you're going to be using. So I hope that's given you some launching off points for doing some of that thinking collectively, for getting the brain power of your team together, even though you can't get your team together in the same room. And unless there are any other questions or burning ideas or anything that anyone wants to share, I think that's pretty much our time today. So it's a chance to say thank you again to FDA Learn and to Keystone, and you've got my details there if there's anything that you wanted to follow up. Perhaps you didn't want to say something in the chat box, but you're very welcome to ping me a message afterwards or follow up with the FDA. But it's been lovely to have you on the call today, and I hope you found it really useful. Oh, and Julia, sorry, the Thinking Alliance is my company, so I do webinars and things for FDA, but in that umbrella. Over to you, Sue.
Well, I'd just like to thank you very much, Katie. That was really informative, interesting. I really enjoyed that. And thank you to everybody who joined us today for the webinar. We both hope you have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you all again soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.